Okay, so I think we're gonna begin our session now for the afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Ashkan Sepahand, and I am a research fellow here at HKV, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's afternoon table talk session on earthly ethics. I'm joined here with three lovely gentlemen, Zev Trachtenberg, who's sitting up front, Will Steffen, and Philip Oswald, who I will proceed to introduce briefly before they make their individual presentations. I wanted to give you a general idea of the structure of this session. We will start with a 10-minute statement commentary by Zev, and then move on to two 5-minute statements from Will and then Philip, and then open up to a general public discussion. So I just wanted to say a few short words about the topic that we will address today, namely earthly ethics. I mean, there's, material written that you can read about it all, so I just kind of wanted to open it with a quote to have us think a bit from Hannah Arendt, who proposed, let's say in a proto-Anthropocenic way, the possibility of imagining a science that would be once more geocentric and anthropomorphic, although not in the old sense of the earth being the center of the universe and of man being the highest being there is. This science would be geocentric in the sense that the earth, and not the universe, is the center and home of mortal man, and it would be anthropomorphic in the sense that man would count his factual mortality among the elementary conditions under which his scientific efforts are possible at all. So I would like to introduce now Zev Trachtenberg, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Oklahoma, go Sooners, who specializes in social and political philosophy. He's participated in various interdisciplinary teaching and research projects related to environmental issues, including the Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Environment program at OU and studies on collaborative watershed management. Welcome, Zev.
Thank you. And thanks to Ashkan and to all, I don't see as many of the organizers here, but to all the organizers, and gosh, to all of us for what we've been through for the last week. I mean, both, oh, the mic, I'm so sorry. Both all the enriching experience that we've all benefited from and the tremendous amount of energy that we've had to invest in that I suspect is being depleted as we go. So I am not entirely sure that I'm going to address the problem statement on the back of the handout that you have, and I sure wish I had had that fabulous quote from Ashkan before I prepared what I'm going to say. But in lieu of those, I decided maybe what I could do today is rather than declaim that much, which is hard for me to resist, of course, but rather what I would try and do is just leave you with some questions that might or might not guide our discussion. And so the first of those questions that I think we need to consider when we talk about earthly ethics, or for that matter any other kind of ethics, is who is the bearer of that ethical obligation? And I think that's a question that we've explored a little bit in various sessions as we've considered the question of individual agency versus social agency. Are we talking about sort of cultivating a change in mind or a change in heart or a change in individual behavior, whatever the source of that might be on the one hand, and on the other hand, are we saying that really the bearer of ethical obligation here is society as a whole, or particular societies, I should say, that is to say specific social structures which manage particular infrastructures, which channelize individual actions to produce the collective outcomes that we are using the word Anthropocene to describe. So that's one question, one way of questioning that. Another sort of sub element there that plays off of the idea of, well, either individual or social, the individual or society being the bearer of that obligation, is the notion of virtue. So that's something that's, well discussed in, philosophical traditions of ethical speculation. And so the question of what does it mean to be virtuous with respect to the environment, with respect to the earth as a whole, what kind of environmental virtues are there, and is that a category, environmental virtue, that applies, again, specifically to individuals? Traditionally, the concept of virtue has been applied to individuals, or is that something that we can meaningfully speak of with respect to institutions as well, to societies? Can we talk about a virtuous society with respect to the environment or to the earth? So that's the first question. Who is the bearer of ethical obligation? The second question is, well, what is the goal? I mean, what are we trying to make happen or have obtain in the world by speaking of earthly ethics? Now, one suggestion that came out in one of the seminars in which I participated was environmental justice. That's really what we're aiming for, finally. And so a lot of the ethical concerns that I observed just listening to the wonderful range of discussions over this last week has really been, in a certain way, extremely anthropocentric. I would have to say that is to say that the ultimate good that's been put forward as the one to be maintained is the good of human beings, of people. And so we've heard a lot about the idea of, for example, health as a category that we want to pay attention to, or social justice, the intertwining of environmental and social harm, economic harm, and so the idea would be that to work towards environmental justice is, in a very deep and important way, perhaps leading way, to improve the condition of human beings. But of course, when people speak of environmental justice, they have in mind other sort of objects as well. Animals, the other creatures on the planet, and perhaps even natural systems altogether. So when we think about ethics or earthly ethics, I think one thing we might want to consider is, what's the goal? What are we trying to obtain through ethical action? I think that raises some really interesting questions. Or further questions. If we think in particular that the goal of ethical concern is the condition of the environment or of nature, that raises, I think, all kinds of questions of, well, what do we mean by that? What is that? Is there a meaningful separation between human systems and natural systems, whereby we can say we're trying to enhance the quality of natural systems independent of the involvement of human beings in them? So a third question is one that the first two I think I probably could have anticipated discussing before I came to this event, but really something that I learned a lot about, or encountered in a very new way for me, is the idea of knowledge production. I spent a lot of time thinking about knowledge, of course, but the notion of knowledge production and the sort of central thematization of that was, I think, something that was very strong and characteristic of this event, and so it really raises the question of how ethical considerations enter into knowledge production. And there are a couple of considerations there. I want to just talk about three. First of all, as there's been a lot of focus on the production of knowledge, obviously, and the sort of the social structures, the power dynamics that are involved in the production process of knowledge. So there are all kinds of ethical concerns that go into that. Access to the means of knowledge production, who participates in those, how the process of creating knowledge might distort in some ways the object which is meant to be known. These are all, I think, very important ethical concerns. Another sort of ethical concern that comes up when we consider knowledge production, and this is, I take it quite obvious, is how is knowledge to be used? When knowledge is produced, what is it produced for? What end is it being put to? And one of the things that we've heard a lot about is the way knowledge production, it generates bodies of information or expertise which are part of a power dynamic, perhaps we've heard just last night about the kind of colonialist enterprise. So it's very clear that when we're talking about knowledge production, ethical considerations come in when we think about how knowledge is applied. But there's a third one that I think perhaps I, as a philosopher, might be, and I say that in a strictly institutional sense. I'm always nervous saying I'm a philosopher because that sounds really pretentious, and I really don't mean it that way. I mean, this is the kind of thing that people on my floor tend to talk about. I'm not saying, there's no normative claim there. But I think something that's characteristically perhaps philosophical, I believe, to talk about in terms of the ethical considerations that enter into knowledge production is something that we might characterize as more purely epistemic, that is to say, that has more to do with what we're trying to denote by the word knowledge itself. And so there are many people within philosophy these days who are working with the concept of epistemic responsibility. All right, so there's an idea of a responsibility to what knowledge is itself. And this is not something that I myself study. I just had to do a quick scan of the Stanford Encyclopedia in order to get a sense of where, what some of the positions are in this. But I think that within the philosophical community anyway, one of the key ideas that's associated with epistemic responsibility is the idea of truth. That is to say that when we're talking about knowledge in some meaningful way, if we want to be responsible in an epistemic way, we have to bear in mind some notion of truth. That is to say, some connection between the representation in the mind or in some social infrastructure of the world, that is what knowledge is supposed to be. There's got to be some relationship. What is that relationship? I don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, nobody really knows what truth is, to be perfectly honest. But I guess one way of characterizing this isn't. I'm sorry. One of the ways of framing this is in terms of a kind of the idea that knowledge needs to be disciplined by the world. So whatever else we want to talk about when we talk about the ethics of knowledge production in terms of who participates in it, how it's applied, I think there's a somewhat distinct idea of how the knowledge is disciplined by the world, how it relates in some semantic way to the way the world is, or so I claim at least. So those are three questions that I think are interesting. They've certainly interesting to me. They've occurred to me, and I think I hope I'm sort of representing a little bit of some of the ideas, some of the thoughts that have come around in our discussions. How am I doing on time? Do I have one more minute? All right. The last thing I want to do is this. We're supposed to be sort of a little critical of the term that we're talking about here. So the term that we were given was earthly ethics. And my immediate response to that was, I really don't want to talk about earthly ethics, and I'll explain why in Q&A if it comes up. I would much rather talk about earthling ethics. That to me is a more resonant term. And I guess my time is out, so we can explore that further in questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Zev. I would like to introduce now Will Steffen, who is joining us all the way from Australia. He is an Earth system scientist at the Australian National University in Canberra, as well as a senior fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Will?
Okay, well, what's an Earth system scientist doing talking about ethics? Well, I think it actually falls out naturally from the term Anthropocene, because as it indicates, Anthropocene is a proposed time period in Earth history. So we're talking about the Earth and the Earth as a whole. But the anthropo, of course, at the front of the word means us, human beings. And when you talk about the Earth and human beings, you immediately connote a relationship between the two. And when you talk about relationships, you can't avoid talking about ethics, because that's the essence of what guides a relationship. So let me just give you a couple examples of the wide spectrum that is out there in terms of the way people might define this relationship or what ethics they might use. There was a seminar here on valuing nature. And in fact, if you're here at the modeling discussion earlier today, you would have seen a very complicated spreadsheet about how we could actually put a monetary value on all of nature. Now, that could be construed as one ethical approach to the relationship between humans and nature. In fact, I would argue that it actually takes ethics out of the equation, because by defining some sort of economic value, you can then let the market operate, and you don't even have to think about ethics. On the other hand, I could go to the other end of the spectrum probably and go to my own country and talk about how indigenous cultures might approach this. And indigenous Australians have an entirely different view of the relationship between themselves and the rest of nature. And they say that in a very simple way. We don't own the country owns us. And that is exactly the opposite of the valuing nature approach. So here we have this spectrum of a 21st century economist sitting at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and an Aboriginal Australian still on the land in Arnhem Land in Northern Australia, and probably everything in between as we go around various cultures and societies around the planet. And that brings me to the last point, which gets back to the seminar that I was involved in, and I think Zev brought this up very nicely in his talk too. Who are the we? We talk about we humans or humanity. But in fact, the critical question that we need to address, not only in defining the Anthropocene, but also in talking about ethics, earthly ethics, earthling ethics, whatever we want to call it. Who are the we? And how does that filter, color how we might approach the ethics for the Earth system? Another question then, of course, is who speaks for the non-human life? Any ethical approach has to take into account that we aren't the only life on the planet. And in fact, if you look at the way ecologists and indeed Earth system scientists talk about, you can't separate different forms of life, nor can you separate life from the rest of the natural world around us, because it is a system, a single system. So I'll leave you with this thought. As an Earth system scientist, we are part of a single system, not systems in plural, although scientists love to break it down into systems, so do economists. We are part of one thing, the Earth system. It's now in a rapidly changing state. What does that mean for our ethical relationship with the rest of nature?
Thank you, Will. I would like to introduce now Philipp Ostwald, who is an architect and a writer and professor for architectural theory and design at the Universität Kassel and former director of the Stiftung Bauhaus Dessau. He co-founded and curated several interdisciplinary projects such as Urban Catalyst, Shrinking Cities, and Volkspalast, and he has published widely on urban planning and architecture and worked for the architectural magazine Arch Plus and the office of OMA. Welcome, Philipp.
Thank you. So I also would like to make some notes. Design is connected to ethics, but that is not I'm focusing on now. I think if we speak about the question of earthly ethics or how you reframed it, I think there's several things come up to my mind. The first thing is that I would like to speak of ethics of matter. Traditionally, a lot of ethics focus on the interaction between human beings. But as the dependency of human existing and an Earth system is obvious, we need also kind of an ethics of matter, how we relate to that. For me, kind of the ethics would be still human-centered, but it needs to establish an ethic in relationship to matter. The second thing I would like to raise is I would like to speak, now we discussed, or it was mentioned, the we. I think that we need something like swarm ethic, or to call it post-heroic ethics. As you all know, the Anthropocene is an accumulation of numberless steps, of unintended effects of enormous amounts of steps. And traditionally, ethics have been concerned about kind of distinguished action and their causes. So like killing somebody, to put it very simply. But that is not the issue we have on the table. It starts already when we like eat a tomato, drive a car. So things which kind of as particular actions are not especially an issue in the kind of accumulation by the big swarm of mankind kind of becomes critical. And it's interesting to look back that there is, in my understanding, like a first Anthropocenic ethic in the discussion after World War II by Günther Anders and Hans Jonas about the issue of nuclear bombing. But this was, of course, like the most extreme sort of heroic action, like one bomb as kind of the kind of most extreme version. And so I think we face a very different, almost opposite issue, which makes it extremely difficult to engage in. The third point I would like to make is that we maybe need to speak about creeping ethics. Maybe you know this poem by Christian Morgenstern, where somebody makes a joke and the laughing comes like a week later. Yeah? So there is kind of a disconnecting between action and effect. And I think that the Anthropocene is in a way like a creeping phenomena, and so it's extremely difficult to grasp in the sense of ethics. So we, I think, also need to address this issue. And in a sense, connected to these three aspects I want to raise, there is obviously an issue also of visibility of evidence, maybe to call it representation, yeah? Because ethics is, of course, kind of a judgment about action, but the question is how you can grasp this action and how it's represented. I don't have an answer for that, I just want to raise this question. And to end, I think that, of course, raising the issue of ethics is something also to claim the free will, which I totally identify with. And I think it's, in a sense, for me, actually at the core of the Anthropocenic issue, because ethics formulate kind of a frame for human action, which is considered as an action of free will. And I think that in the end, we need kind of to find new ways, new forms of ethics, in order to come, and it's not less than that, to a new step of civilization. It's kind of the Anthropocene era right now is a kind of very chaotic, unintended result of human action, and if we don't consolidate as a civilization to make this to more a framed, reflectionary process, then it's what we discussed. Thank you.